Transitioning back to the main series, we reach the much talked about Metal Gear Solid 4, the entry which some people define as the peak of the series, and some people describe as the biggest mistake in the entire franchise. As for the development of the game, we reach yet another point where Kojima has already stated during the production and release of MGS3 that he's done, he's out, it's his last Metal Gear game, only to go and start making MGS4 as one of the brand new PS3's most notable console exclusives. I'd say more than any other game, however, the content of MGS4 reflects this hesitance to continue the series from Kojima, resulting in a story that's arguably one of his most personal, and has the main protagonist emulate Kojima himself in many ways. The reason for his return, by the way, wasn't due to any newfound inspiration or want to continue the series. It instead came from the fans' negative reception to him stepping down, and the threats he suffered against his own life because of that. Talk about a respectful fan base, Jesus Christ. This man gives you some of your favourite gaming experiences and you treat him like this in return. Utterly insane behaviour from that side of the Metal Gear fanbase, and it makes Kojima's return to the series seem even more tainted because of that fact. He clearly doesn't want to make these games anymore, but the pressure of what will happen if he stops is forcing him to continue working on them. And that is where we enter MGS4. Needless to say, knowing what it took for this game to get developed and released under Kojima's control, it leaves a slightly bad taste in my mouth. But regardless, we're going to be viewing this game from an objective point of view, leaving creator and fan politics to the side. And right from the opening screen, MGS4 irks the feel of a true final Metal Gear experience. With hindsight, we obviously know this isn't actually the true ending of the series, but even when looking back to it, finality is definitely at the centre of this one. It's Kojima's final statement for the series, and the final Metal Gear that I think resembles the core elements of what makes a Metal Gear game a Metal Gear game. We'll see when looking at the last two games that Kojima does actually stick to his guns this time round. I think MGS4 is the last game in the series that feels like it's got all the elements I remember and attach with from the past games in the series. It feels like Metal Gear, whereas every Metal Gear Kojima made past this point, in my opinion, starts resembling something else, something that doesn't quite fit in line with what we're familiar with, and for a very good reason. If this is Kojima's farewell to the series, while at the same time still feeling chained to it, the games in the series past this point are Kojima's attempt to implement ideas that he enjoys onto a series that he wants nothing to do with anymore. As we'll see when jumping into it, but I think MGS4 gets a lot of criticism in this regard, due to it being released in between this transformation. Kojima's making a game here that's aiming to tie up all loose ends and close off the series as we know it, while also caring as little as he ever has about the story and characters. 2 years after the release of MGS4, Kojima put out a tweet that I think sums up quite well what his mindset would have most likely been during development. MGS is my creation, but it's not mine. So whatever form it takes, as long as there are fans, MGS will be created. Whether I leave the industry, leave this world, just like any other popular classic series, sequel rights are essential when giving movie rights to Hollywood. This is the right to create a sequel regardless of the original author. I think Kojima rightfully has a lot of pride about his creation, but he's already realised long ago that it's almost completely out of his hands. It will be made with or without him, and the fact that people are now sending threats on his life might be even scarier if the product that's released without his involvement doesn't please fans. Finality is key in MGS4. The Metal Gears we see past this point, in my eyes, are games which are trapped inside of a Metal Gear shell. The ideas they have are Kojima wanting to experiment experiment, but doing it inside of a foundation that he no longer wants to be a part of, yet one that he also has to adhere to for the fans' sake. So yeah, a damn depressing start, and that's something else I think carries over to the majority of the MGS4 experience. I'd say it's easily one of the most depressing games I've ever played, but that's a major strength in my eyes. The newfound darkness, and what I think a lot of people describe as somewhat of a lack of personality, actually ends up feeding into the core themes and emotions the game conveys really well in my opinion. I mean, from the title screen, which I have to mention looks astonishing by the way, we're brought back to the graveyard at the end of MGS3 and have some old man standing in front of the boss's grave smoking a cigarette. Trailers which were released before the game, obviously making people aware who this person is, but we'll save that reveal when actually getting into the game. The music here as well just sounds so fantastic. The music we hear in this opening screen being this game's main theme, known as Old Snake, reflecting even more how hopeless and bleak the entire experience is going to be. From the very start of the game, however, we've got one big technical drawback that I want to mention immediately. With the several options we're given here, most people's first instinct would obviously be to start a new game, but that's actually a mistake in my eyes. Instead, the first thing I think anyone should do when playing MGS4 is going to the Install tab and installing the entire game right off the bat. I think it's best we get this out there straight away, as it's one of the things MGS4 is criticised for more than anything else, and that's the horrendous installation times that take place within the game itself. All things considered, this game was still released during the early stages of the PS3's life cycle, and for a game that still looks pretty fantastic today, bar for some performance issues that we'll get into later on, it's at least understandable why these installation screens are here. The only issue is, as I said, is that if you don't bulk install the game on the main menu screen, you're made to wait a while after each chapter of the game so that it can install the next one. Now, for some, this might actually be a positive. MGS4 is a genuinely long game, and these installation periods may work as a way for players to call it a day and pick the game back up later on. However, if you're looking to just play through the experience in long stretches, you're inevitably going to reach a point where you're made to wait for the next part of the game to install. Installing from the main menu is definitely the best option in my opinion. I think it was something that was ultimately segmented throughout the game to begin with, due to the very recent advent of online installations. Going back to MGS4 nowadays, I'm actually quite surprised by how quick the installations were from a chapter to chapter basis, with the digital purchasing of games now becoming more and more common, and almost every game now requiring some kind of massive day one patch. It's not uncommon to be waiting double, triple, or maybe even quadruple the length of even the bulk MGS4 installation sometimes. So while I'd say it's not great to have the experience sporadically interrupted with installs, it's an issue which I personally think has been lessened over time. I remember as a kid feeling like these screens were never ending, but I've got a feeling that it was both childish impatience and my present mind now being accustomed to long download times in the modern era video games. For me, they took around 3 to 5 minutes on average, and the content that's being installed in this case contains some of the most insane moments in the series. Not your latest 25 gig glorified bug patch, which tends to be the case with most big video games nowadays. Finally starting a new game, we're given all the options we've become used to throughout the past few games, all the difficulty settings now being renamed to feature all the names of the most pivotal characters in the series, like Liquid, the boss, and Solid. And after we hit start, we're brought into easily the strangest opening sequence of any Metal Gear game so far.
You have answered 9 out of 10 questions right, Melissa. You have 1 question left.
Filling? Yeah, no, it's filling. Believe me, he ain't lying.
This is in no way your typical mission briefing. In fact, there's no mission being given at all currently. What Kojima decides to do instead is, from the very first moment in the game, give the player an insight into what the world is like following the events of MGS2. It should be noted that in terms of the chronology of the series, excluding Metal Gear Rising, MGS4 is the last chronological game in the series, and although it's only set in 2014, we'll see how the brand new technology we saw in MGS2 has now become outdated, with everything seemingly advancing at a rapid rate. Staying with this opening for now, but I think this is a downright genius opening sequence, setting it up in the context of several TV channels that we can flick through, all of which appear to be genuinely well produced, even despite the fact these segments have been purposely designed in a way where you won't be able to watch all of them all the way through. When you switch over to another channel, the shows on all the other channels don't magically pause, and for a segment that can't be returned to until the players start a new game, it's kind of amazing that Kojima was able to get away with something like this. There's clearly a lot of effort that went into creating each of these different shows, as well as the advertisements which follow on from them. them. I just find it astounding that someone gave Kojima the green light to go with this approach, considering a lot of players may never replay the game again, thus having them not even witness all the different channels in their entirety. Hell, I don't even think I have, and MGS4 was hands down my favourite game for a long time. I think what these TV channels do right from the start, much like MGS3 did, is set up the tone of the game. And talking of MGS3, this game couldn't get any further away from the goofy, over-the-top nature of that game. What Kojima's trying to convey with these channels is the state of the world, and the information, entertainment, and propaganda that's being sent out to the masses. It seems that coming into this game, the Patriots have well and truly won coming off the events of MGS2. Everything that AI mentioned about censorship and creating context has actually come to fruition. So, what did the masses have to sit and watch in Metal Gear's version of 2014? Well, we've got game shows, informational programs about wildlife, the key detail in this one being the long list of devastating world events which are merely shown in a little box in the corner, out of sight and out of mind for the average viewer. A food channel with people showing you food that could be prepared in a bomb shelter, almost hinting at the possibility of this becoming a reality. The more blatant stuff, however, comes from all the adverts which follow on from these TV shows. The majority of them feature a heavy emphasis on conflict and weaponry, even if that ad's content seemingly has nothing to do with it. You'll just see people holding or firing weapons. Just keep in mind, this is what's now being shown to the general public. War has become so commonplace and ordinary that we can assume people are no longer opposing it, just accepting it as a reality that can't be changed. War has become unavoidable, and the Patriots made it that way. And the TV channels give us a clear perspective on the disturbing content that's being pumped out to the masses. The whole reason being so they can continue to proceed with operations that would have previously had to be handled with maximum secrecy, out in plain view. They're putting themselves into a situation where the public are desensitized. The risk of the Patriots slipping up is slim to none. Actions, policies, anything that would have been controversial in the past is now accepted. And this is what we were talking about when looking at the negatives of the AI's approach of having total control. MGS4 kicks things off masterfully in my opinion, showcasing several channels which coalesce into one impactful statement which resonates throughout the entire game, as well as just being cool in itself. As I said, the shows are really well produced, and I love the fact we're given the opportunity to see David Hayter himself during the TV interview on Celebrity Moralist. This show being particularly hilarious due to the entire point being revolved around how no matter what David Hayter says, the host just makes up her own version of what he means in her head, and then convinces the audience and assumedly the viewer at home that her perceival of his mindset is correct.
What are your dreams?
Well, I'd have to say my dream project...
Let your dreams drive you.
A message of hope to today's young people from David Hayter.
I never actually said that.
Just outright propaganda, basically. It's why we see him become almost disheveled by the end of the segment. We're already set up with some rather bleak stakes, and that only continues when reaching the opening cutscene of the game. The somber music, featuring strings and guitar, working really well, not only to match this Middle Eastern environment we found ourselves in, but also works in matching the tone of the story overall. Again, it might not be clear yet because we've literally just started the game, but this is a game that's devoid of hope for the majority of it, focusing on how bad things are only going to get worse, and the ones in control can never be toppled. All of this only gets further reinforced during Snake's opening monologue, one of the most iconic opening passages to any game I've ever played.
War has changed. It's no longer about nations, ideologies, or ethnicity. It's an endless series of proxy battles fought by mercenaries and machines. War and its consumption of life has become a well-oiled machine.
We can hear Snake's voice straight away as even more raspy compared to before, and the brief glimpses we get of him here reveals how he now sports a grey mustache, with his skin appearing wrinkled. Much like the TV shows, what Snake says here sets up what's changed since MGS2. War is something that's described as just happening, it's a way of life. Whereas before, there were two opposing sides of a conflict that would hold different views based on politics, religion, race, and so on. Now, wars are seemingly being fought just for the sake of it. All of the weapons which are being used on the battlefield have IDs. The emotions and physical capabilities of soldiers are regulated via nanomachines. Everything's been set up by the Patriots to ensure that these wars which are being fought can be ongoing. They don't want either side to win and have absolute control, which makes it so that war becomes routine for all the different sides involved. This opening's great all round, not just from Snake's monologue, but also the visuals we see that back up essentially everything he's saying. The fidelity of everything is still pretty astounding today. You may have already noticed that Kojima's style for the cutscenes this time round revolves heavily around the idea of painting out war in the most realistic way possible, in turn having this up-close, intentionally messy, shaky cam effect during most cutscenes, to emulate the types of documentary footage that we oftentimes witness on the battlefield. It's done very well, however, even though I'd say it's a bit more freeform compared to the more static cuts and transitions from past games. MGS4's style is definitely just as considered and distinct in its own right. Just because Kojima's gone for the approach of this more grounded, realistic directing style with a greater emphasis on longer lasting shots, it's still undeniably quality. Another thing we have to take into account with this opening cutscene, which translates to most of the cutscenes and gameplay sections, is just the sheer level of detail that's on show here. This is a game that you could show to anyone at the time and have the term next gen make a whole lot of sense. Despite the numerous technical hindrances which the PS3 is now infamous for, what the development team were able to achieve is simply unbelievable. We're now working with full HD, immensely detailed texture work, shadow, lighting, and particle effects which are miles ahead of anything we've seen in the franchise up to this point, all the while working on a console that many developers described as an absolute nightmare to make games on. There is only one drawback, however, and you would have been able to see it essentially from the opening moments of the cutscene, and that's the performance. I can appreciate MGS4 carrying on the tradition of having all of its cutscenes take place within the in-game engine instead of being pre-rendered. Pre-rendered cutscenes will never not lead to somewhat of a detachment for me. For as much as people like to praise Cyberpunk's visuals, just comparing the trailers on the run-up to its release shows a very noticeable difference between what that actual game looks like. The character models look and behave like they've been ripped right from a game made by Bethesda. At no point did I ever think Cyberpunk, in terms of sheer fidelity, ever matched that single shot from the 2019 trailer of V washing his hands in the sink. That, along with many other shots in the trailer, look incredibly realistic, and ultimately led to disappointment when I realised the actual game doesn't look anything like this. It's good, but nowhere near the level of the trailers. You might say, well, that should be expected at this point, and while that's correct, I don't particularly expect a game to look anything like the story trailers anymore. It doesn't remove the detachment which I mentioned. Surprisingly, Cyberpunk gets away with it in terms of the game alone, as it doesn't actually feature any of the pre-rendered cutscenes we saw in the trailers. Most noticeably on games released for the PS1 and 2, however, where the fidelity was just not there in terms of the gameplay. We tended to see many games featuring cutscenes that depicted the characters of the story in far closer detail than their in-game models, which is fine on one hand, because it potentially leads the player to draw a closer attachment to the character in question, as they're actually able to see them properly, and don't have to squint their eyes or try to make out a face from the numerous pixels that are on screen. But on the other, it can also result in the character developing an inconsistency when comparing the two different models. Either way, the ultimate point was, I find it admirable to use the in-game engine for all the cutscenes in MGS4. When you acknowledge that's the approach they're taking, you can't help but even further appreciate how good this game looks. As I said, the texture work, level of detail, animations, they're all good enough to make the gameplay blend perfectly with the cutscenes, which is something we see them actively pursuing here, having many of the cutscenes transition out seamlessly and put control back into the player's hands. A lot more free-flowing and natural compared to the fades to black that we usually get in these games. The fidelity, however, does sacrifice the performance, and quite significantly too. Despite being one of the most visually impressive PS3 games, and to be honest, one of the most visually impressive games that I've ever played, it does happen to also be the MGS game that runs by far the worst. Port this game over to the PS4 or 5 and you've immediately got no problems. It would undeniably run at 60 FPS on either of those two consoles in my opinion. But with this game being currently trapped on the PS3, despite there almost being confirmation it will eventually be ported over to newer consoles in Volume 2 of the Master Collection, I have to say, the FPS just isn't good enough. It's a stunning game, and I can't personally say I would have liked the graphics to have been reined in so the game could run a little better. But the issue is, there'll be a large number of people who will favour performance over fidelity, and they've got every reason to. Typically, that's the stance I would usually side with. I think if I wasn't so accustomed to to the MGS4 experience, I would find the FPS drags down the game more than I perhaps do now. But yeah, graphics may be great, but the FPS really isn't. It is surprisingly unlocked, so you can actually witness the game running at 60 FPS when switching over to night vision, but the vast majority of the experience will mostly be running at around 30 FPS, and even then, that's a number which can fluctuate quite significantly depending on what events are occurring on screen. Back to the game, however, as Snake gets onto the battlefield and lets out a few rounds from his assault rifle, the gun jams, meaning that we'll be having to procure weaponry on site once again, something that might be a bit tougher this time round due to Snake's mention of how guns are now ID tagged, perhaps only allowing certain users to shoot them. When finally being given control, there's numerous elements that we can start picking out straight away, but let's ensure we take our time with this so we don't get overwhelmed. Starting with the HUD, we're able to see already that certain elements which were introduced in MGS3 were brought back, but there's just as many which are either significantly streamlined or removed entirely. The health and stamina bars are back, pretty much unchanged, except for the stamina now being segmented into 4 separate sections, and also being renamed to Psyche, both of which don't particularly matter all that much. But beneath that, we've now got a stress meter, which as we'll find when playing the game, will begin to increase or decrease depending on certain actions we perform. There's the obvious stuff that you can imagine increases Snake's stress levels, things like being caught, taking part in firefights, taking damage and stuff like that. But there's also some subtler additions, like having the sun raises stress levels, where going into shade also sees them decrease.
Over there!
The stress all ties into the Psyche gauge essentially, with the effects of having a low Psyche gauge being almost identical to MGS3, having slower health regeneration and a heavy amount of sway while aiming. As for the other elements on screen, we're already pretty much accustomed with all of them, featuring our equipment and weapon inventory slots and the camo index in the top right, this time also having a compass, which can oftentimes guide us towards our next goal. An addition which I usually would criticise, if not for MGS4's significantly more open and sprawling level design. And as we'll eventually see when acquiring the solid eye, we do also get the return of a full-fledged radar, one that does actually end up outclassing the Soliton radar, and unfortunately makes the experience just a bit too easy, even on the highest difficulties. Not easy in the sense that the player won't die or get caught up in a firefight, but just easy in terms of observation overall. Whereas MGS3 seemed to actively focus the player's attention predominantly in the game world, MGS4 takes a step back and reintroduces the radar system, which I've always criticised for arguably being too helpful and too useful for a stealth game like this. Although that's another issue with this game I'll elaborate on later. Finally for now, you could see in the bottom left that we now have the return of rations as a healing item. I wasn't lying when I said MGS4 had the health regeneration system from MGS3. Depending on your psyche and stress levels, you will be able to regenerate your health just fine when outside of battle. However, with the return of rations, as well as several other healing items which both affect our health and psyche this time round, healing has now returned to a place I'm a lot happier with. It would have been kind of interesting to see them flesh out the cure mechanic and make it genuinely satisfying to use, but I'm not complaining that they stripped out either. Ultimately, it's a mechanic that I'd argue was best suited to MGS3's feeling of being stranded out in the wilderness with little to no equipment. And the same goes for the food system, which has also been removed, with these elements not taking away from the experience at all in my opinion. Some people have the misconception that because one game had a certain set of mechanics, that if they get stripped out or pared down in future titles, is an active regression. However, as I said with the cure and food system, those two elements are ones that fit a lot better with MGS3 in terms of gameplay and tone. I think the hunger system would have been especially weird to see return in MGS4, due to us being out in the middle of war zones the majority of the time. The only wildlife I can really remember seeing sporadically throughout the game were things like birds, rats, and things like snakes later on. The wildlife is still there, however, but I don't think that should just be ignored, despite not even having a function anymore, where literally shooting any of these will just result in the creature lying dead on the floor. They've still been implemented to breathe even more life into a world that I already think has an immense amount of character to begin with. Getting back to where we were though, the opening gameplay section here is merely used as a way to get us accustomed with the controls, I assume. There's no real kind of obvious test of our stealth or shooting abilities like in previous games, but one thing that it showcases right off the bat is arguably one of the biggest positives and criticisms that gets thrown at MGS4, and that's the cutscenes. MGS4 features some of the longest cutscenes in any game you'll ever play, and it's not merely a case of them being all relatively long to begin with, but it's the abundance of them, some would say overabundance, which is a big issue for people as well, and I completely completely understand that. I'm pretty sure most people who have a dislike towards how many cutscenes there are in this game and how long they go on for can acknowledge they still feature great direction, a lot of style in terms of Kojima's in-game work, and the classic Yoji Shinkawa drawings during other moments. But this is a game that at points doesn't feel like a game whatsoever. You will genuinely find that if you put your controller down at the start of a lot of these cutscenes, it'll automatically switch itself off before they're finished. We'll dive into that aspect more, however, when reaching some of the truly substantial cutscenes in the game. For now, staying with the intro, all the cutscenes here I think are just magnificent at setting up the world, and some of the new technology that's being used on the battlefield. The most game-changing one that we see being what's known as the geckos. It seems like what Snake and Otacon have been trying to prevent ever since MGS1 has finally come true. What we're essentially seeing here is a mass-produced, destructive, and highly mobile Metal Gear, its head being quite similar to the head of Metal Gear Rex, really drilling this point in that everything we've been fighting against has now ultimately been achieved by the Patriots. The geckos as an enemy, both in and out of gameplay, are very intimidating and totally bizarre. The first, and perhaps most distinct characteristic of the geckos appears before they're even on screen, and that's the weird cow moo they let out, as well as the more ambient cicada sounds.
Hit him hard!
The meaning of these initially being unclear, but being explained as a way to psychologically disarm their opponents by providing the enemy with sounds linked to peace and tranquility before the geckos pounce on them. Really interesting stuff, and probably one of the weirdest enemies we've in the series so far, and that's saying a lot. This cutscene alone makes them look terrifying, showing off their huge long legs, their heavy resistance to bullets, and the ease in which they're able to take out enemies with either bullets or a quick stomp. We're put back into the gameplay at this point and are made to make our way forward, avoiding the gecko. And although the threat of them is definitely intimidating, I found when attempting to sneak past the majority of them, it felt like quite a confusing and unsatisfying experience. We already lack the cones of vision this time round, but with an enemy that's as high-tech and frenetic as the gecko, it's really difficult to gauge where it's looking and if it'll detect you. Later on in the game, when acquiring the solid eye, we're able to switch to a mode that gives us a much easier time gauging where they're looking, which also exposes the fact that being caught by them isn't merely based on their head turning in your general direction. They've actually got a scanner that rapidly moves around. The only problem is it's invisible to the naked eye, so you can naturally assume where some of my frustration comes from here. I think that animations and behaviour from the geckos were a particular highlight for me. I love how they occasionally stand up to moo, or bend down to get a clearer visual on the targets on the ground. There was one detail here that I've never even witnessed before my last playthrough, where a gecko actually grabbed onto the side of the building I was hiding in and pulled itself up to look inside. Things like that felt incredibly dynamic at the time, but I do also acknowledge that I don't think I saw them do that for the entire rest of the game. I do still think it's cool though. Reaching the end of the area, in which you probably already noticed stealth hasn't particularly been a priority whatsoever, we're brought into yet another cutscene. This one showing the return of the first-person mode during the cutscenes from MGS3, as well as a brilliant action set piece between Snake and the geckos. It's here where we also get the full reveal of Snake. The scene quickly becomes a mix of epic and tragic when seeing Snake in all of his glory, or I guess lack of glory, now being referred to only as Old Snake, the only part that appears to stay intact and untouched from the Snake we previously knew being his bandana. Impressively, however, we also see his combat skills haven't slowed down one bit. From how he deals with the multiple gecko here, we still see that he's agile, quick thinking, and uses his equipment and weaponry to their full potential. The most impressive piece of equipment we see being his brand new sneaking suit, which leads into this fantastic streamlining of the camo system in terms of the gameplay. Snake's suit this time round now has the ability to perfectly blend into the environment around him, as we see in the final moments of this cutscene where Snake uses it to blend into a wall and trick the gecko into stepping on a box filled with melons. The "no place for Hideo" message written on the box always being somewhat of a mystery to me. Some say it's an inside joke, others think it's a reference to Kojima's reluctance to be involved with the Metal Gear series, and perhaps the gaming industry as a whole. Either way, I've always found that actions revolved around this box very intentional. A box that has that phrase on it being stepped on and destroyed, the melons emulating blood. I personally feel like it perhaps does have something to do with Kojima's place in the gaming industry. From the pressure he was under when going into this game, it's not a far out concept to imagine he wanted to step away entirely, feeling like the game industry was no longer a place for him to feel creative and safe to do what he wants anymore. After his encounter with the geckos, we get the wonderfully stark and desolate old Snake theme once again, while panning up and showing the pure destruction that lays bare in front of Snake. It's just reinforcing the message that we've lost over and over again. Although it's not how it initially appears, from this opening segment, Snake himself now appears to be feeding into the war routine the Patriots have cultivated. The images we see of him being brought into the battlefield along with all the other rebels being more symbolic to me. Although he does ultimately have a greater mission at hand, he's almost no different to all the others fighting around him. Something else we should also realise right from the start is the difference in weaponry from both of the previous games starting off. Whereas in the past couple titles, non-lethal options have become more and more prevalent, literally starting both MGS 2 and 3 with only a tranquilizer. MGS 4 starts you off only with weapons that are lethal, being very telling of how the climate of war has changed for all parties involved. Even though we do eventually end up being given a range of non-lethal weapons, I think the fact we're only given lethal ones at the very start reinstates the point which Snake makes about how war has changed. Just like how war's changed, so will our approach when it comes to tackling this game. We already briefly saw it within the gameplay segment against the geckos, but MGS 4 is a game that has such a lack of emphasis on the stealth gameplay that, in my opinion, it's reasonable for someone to think this game is unintentionally a downgrade compared to the previous titles, but also to think of this as something that's been thrown in entirely on purpose to further reflect the type of warzone we're now fighting in. One where violence prevails, staying in the shadows is nigh on impossible, and an old Snake can't use the same tactics and strategies he once did. We're taken out of the conflict in whatever Middle Eastern country we found ourselves in, and are brought back 3 days earlier, Snake standing at the grave of who we can presume is the boss and saluting. I do like the grey lifelessness of the scene here, whereas many other pieces of media tend to end up looking grey out of a lack of creativity. The grey here obviously feeds into numerous elements, some of which have a purpose in terms of the game itself, and others that could be argued to be a bit more meta. For example, I think there's reason to say that another big criticism from this game, that being the overwhelming amount of fan service, is something Kojima is 100% aware of. It might sound ridiculous to some, but for someone that's written a plot as intricate and interesting as MGS 2, I find it very hard from that point on to believe that his future projects aren't filled with the same kind of intentionality. And I'd say even looking all the way back to MGS 1, that sense of intentionality has always been present in Kojima's work, whether it be revolved around the story, themes, or even the tone. A moment like this, where Snake is literally replicating something we saw pulled off far more effectively and emotionally in the previous game, is now entirely grey and feels hollow. It doesn't have the same emotional reverence as back then, and I think that's the point. I personally believe that a large amount of the fan service in this game is almost ironic. In a way, you could argue MGS4 itself is the exact same way. Kojima didn't want to make it, but he's giving the fans what they want, so as a result, we're seeing the content of the game reflect that exact same kind of mentality. It's kind of spiteful in a way, a critique of the Metal Gear fanbase and their vitriolic behaviour that pushed Kojima to make this game. But I think that's how I genuinely perceive it, as opposed to just being misguided. There is the other side of that, however, in that taking this content a bit more literally, it really is just that, hollow. I can understand why a lot of people despise the repetition of moments like the salute from MGS3. On the surface, it's totally unoriginal and doesn't even make any sense. We have to presume here that Solid Snake doesn't even know who the boss is, so it's likely Big Boss's grave that he's saluting, which would make tonal sense. We could imagine that Big Boss's grave would be placed directly next to his former mentor, but the implication of the salute here is that Big Boss was Snake's former mentor, which is just not true. Snake's got no reason to salute Big Boss at all. He was literally born with his ability, ways, he didn't learn them, and also showed no sense of admiration to Big Boss at all, only hatred. Remember, Big Boss has never been described as having anywhere near the relationship with Snake as he did with the boss, so it feels like a hollow fan service moment with little to no meaning outside of, do you remember the salute from MGS3? Well, here it is again. What's even more on the nose here is the brand new flashback mechanic. These are frequently shown in cutscenes now by flashing the X button at the top of the screen and having memories and information from the past be interspersed in between the main cutscene. I mean, this is literally just the member berries mechanic. Is there really a need for this to be here? It's almost like an acknowledgement that either the story's gotten too convoluted for people to even remotely understand it without being re-informed of certain information in previous games, or it's just a fan service thing again. Thinking about it, both of those actually kind of apply, and the third, and in my opinion undeniable option, is that these were put in for both of the previous two reasons, as well as merely to liven up the cutscenes. They must have known how ridiculously long some of these cutscenes were, so implemented a full mechanic that gives the player even the smallest amount of interactivity during them, so it kind of still feels like a game. I think with how the cutscenes are handled in Kojima's next Metal Gear after this, that being Peace Walker, that this option is definitely something that would have at least been considered here, as it appears the interactive aspect of cutscenes was ramped up even more in Peace Walker, and that's a game that has nowhere near the amount of cutscenes as MGS4. Overall, I'm kind of nonplussed by this mechanic. It doesn't feel necessary to me, but I don't think it hurts the experience either. If its goal was to remind players of certain events which took place in the past, however, it most definitely failed. The images that flash up on screen are shown for such a short amount of time, and the sound effects, while sounding quite cool, occasionally end up being far louder than the dialogue, meaning there's points where I was pressing X to flash these images up on screen, while not actually hearing their relevance in the actual conversation that's taking place. After Snake's salute, the image does start brightening up, with Otacon coming to meet Snake from a helicopter.
Otacon, even the dead have ears.
Snake, we've got to go.
Otacon explains, Zoroark tries to explain to Snake and us, the audience, why he's literally turned into an old man despite only being 42 years old. I'd say at the time, it's easily one of the most bizarre switch-ups from the previous games, and the change is even more startling when someone like Otacon is stood beside Snake. Both characters in MGS2 looked relatively the same age, whereas Snake now looks like he could be Otacon's dad. Snake obviously appears to have rapidly advanced aging, which Otacon pins down to Werner syndrome, a real-life condition which induces premature aging and an increased chance of developing a cancer of some kind. The only issue is, they don't even know what the cause is, leaving this mystery up in the air, which we'll eventually end up discovering as the game goes on. I do like that aspect of the game. Outside of Snake's main mission objective, we're now more invested in Snake's well-being than ever before. It's pretty heartbreaking to hear this legendary hero that we've grown to love saying that he's only got around a year left at best, the direction for this moment in particular being fantastic, with Snake observing his wrinkled hands and accepting his fate.
Year at best, right?
Yeah. Snake, let's try another doctor.
It won't make any difference. I'm not an ordinary man to begin with. Not to mention Fox die.
You're right.
Not long after, we end up meeting Colonel Campbell, who's waiting in the helicopter. Paul Eading's voice performance here now returning to the more naturalistic style we saw in MGS1.
Well, I'm not a colonel anymore, Snake.
I figured the only place you dressed like that would be at your daughter's wedding. What are you doing these days?
I'm working for an organization under the UN Security Council.
This alone being the main reason as to why I perceive his voice performance in MGS2 to be one of the best I've ever heard. Hearing him here reveals that his robotic dialogue in MGS2 that's just inconspicuous enough to not assume he's actually an AI was entirely intentional. You don't go from quality voice performance in 1, dodgy 1 and 2, and then back to quality in 4.
A lot of soldiers can't handle the stress of battle, end up panicking.
The bright dot in the middle is you, Raiden. The red dots are your enemies, and the blue cone shape represents their field of vision.
There's not even a semblance of the MGS2 Colonel here. His delivery's gone back to the more gruff and human delivery from 1. And talking of voice performances, while Otacon remains pretty much the exact same as he's always been, just listen to Snake's performance here.
This is Snake. Do you read me?
What's the situation?
I'm just inside the city limits.
I'll be honest, we've reached a point where I can begin to understand some people having an issue with David Hayter's voice performance. Ever since MGS1, he's become more and more over the top in terms of his line delivery. Snake back then sounded a lot more human. The grit to his voice wasn't as strong as it would get in future titles.
I only felt truly alive when I was staring death in the face. I don't know. Maybe it's written into my genes.
And while I still think MGS2 was the peak of Hayter's voice performance as Snake, 4 is where even I was starting to occasionally laugh at just how gravelly his voice was.
Yeah, I hear they added that to my rap sheet too.
I understand it's all revolved around his old Snake status at this point, but whereas I just found his voice performances to be undeniably iconic and stellar in 1 and 2, 3 and 4, I can genuinely understand where the criticisms start to arise. It's bordering a joke sometimes. What we see during this helicopter ride is the stakes of the game getting set, with Campbell telling us that they've identified the location of Liquid, who, if you remember, had begun to inhabit the body of Ocelot in MGS2, now assumedly taking permanent control.
Liquid is lying in wait in a Middle Eastern war zone. Track him down.
This is Snake's final mission, being told to go to the Middle East and hunt down Liquid. The image of this currently unknown girl making eggs is shown in between our transition back to the Middle East, the eggs being a recurring segment at the beginning of each act, which symbolises all 3 sons of Big Boss, as we hear her say right at the start when mentioning Solidus taking the day off, telling us the 2 eggs here resemble Solid and Liquid Snake, the yolk of the egg on the left breaking, whereas the one on the right is perfect, representing the dominant and recessive genes, which were a key emphasis of Snake and Liquid's relationship in MGS1. Returning to the mission at hand, we're immediately put into a codec call with Otacon, this version of the codec being easily the most futuristic and stylized version in the entire series. It's kind of like a mix between 2 and 3's codec and radio screens. We now have the return of the animated character models on the screen to the right hand side, although I will add that this time round, this only applies to a set number of people we call up. The majority of frequencies we call will actually just have a static image, which is slightly disappointing, considering the actual mechanics of the codec still lies solely in our nanomachines, just like MGS2, and that game didn't have most characters with a static portrait. We do spend most of our time talking to Otacon throughout this game, however, so I wouldn't say it's lazy. I think it was just yet another decision based around style, and in some cases, keeping the reveal of certain characters secret and leaving the player in suspense. Everything else is about as we expect though, and I'd say it's tied with MGS2 for being my favourite codec in the series. I think the large area Otacon takes up alone will make a lot of players who weren't particularly interested in the codec calls pay a bit more attention, as there's just more to look at here. Otacon tells us a bit more about the Gecko and informs us that besides just finding Liquid, we first have to meet up with a group of army operatives that apparently know his location. After that, we're put into the game properly this time round, and are given a gameplay sequence that more closely resembles the sneaky stealth action we're familiar with in the past. The first thing that pops up on our screen when gaining back control was the Octo Camo. This item acquired text now popping up when discovering any kind of brand new equipment or weapon that you've never picked up before. The Octo Camo is one of my favourite aspects of the entire game. I think the way it perfectly blends into every environment imaginable, whether you're pressing yourself up against a wall or lying flat on the ground, is absolutely flawless. The suit itself feels high-tech, both for the setting of MGS4, but also for the game itself. I'm not entirely sure what it took to implement the Octo Camo into the game, and how many different variables had to be taken into account depending on what search you're attempting to blend into. But for something that appears to work so well, and in such an easy and simplistic fashion too, I can't imagine it would have been the easiest thing to put in the game. Regardless though, this fixes quite literally all of the issues from the camo system in MGS3. As you could assume, there's no more need to go to the pause menu and swap out the camo anymore, although there is still a camo tab you can access if you actually prefer the way MGS3 went about things. It's something I would never personally do, but it allows the player to play in the way that they desire, as well as being a tab that as we progress is able to be filled up with numerous different secret camos, and many colours and textures which are very rare to come across in the game itself, showing that the camo isn't all about actual camouflage here. Perhaps in some of the more action-oriented moments of the game where stealth doesn't really matter, you'll decide to put on a camo that's more to your actual tastes, as opposed to trying to blend into the environment. Overall, I just love the Octo Camo system. It's hands down the simplicity which stands out. It allows players who are unfamiliar with the game to more easily discover and understand both the camo and camo index systems, and is all round just streamlined immensely well to remove the incredibly annoying back and forth we had in MGS3, going in and out of menus just to pick the camo with the highest number. And not to mention, although the Octo Camo automatically blends into your surroundings now, giving you the most optimal camouflage possible possible. If you like the idea of taking the camo into your own hands, there's now a bit more mystery in terms of picking your camos manually, as all of the plus and minus numbers have been removed as well. Looking at the actual gameplay section, however, we're able to make numerous discoveries about multiple things related to the gameplay, level, and world design. So let's not get too ahead of ourselves and just look at certain things right now. For someone coming into this game off the bat of playing all the other Metal Gears, there's some differences that will be almost immediately noticeable, perhaps ones that we already witnessed from the very start of the game. Snake can run, walk, and go prone like normal, but by far the best addition is the crouch walk, feeling fast, natural, and pretty much exactly what we've always wanted. It's an addition that's so
And we're back.
makes Snake's movements so natural that I can see why it's something that remained in the series right up until the very end. In the case of Peace Walker, actually removing the crawling and solely having the crouch walk. It's one of those additions that feels like it should have always been in these games, to be honest, and I think will undeniably take some getting used to when going back to older titles after playing MGS4. And hilariously, there's even a subtle detail here which I think kind of makes reference to how insane it is that out of all the games to bring in the crouch walk, it's the one where Snake is an old man with less mobility than he's ever had before. This occurs when crouching for a prolonged amount of time, in which we'll see Snake rub his back, indicating that he's starting to get some back pains. A great and necessary addition, although I don't know if I can say that for some of the other inclusions. The level design here is more open, but in terms of the game at large, it isn't as consistently quality as we see in the first act. From this opening gameplay section, we're able to witness things like multiple different ways to head forward, being on the right, left, and middle of this street, which eventually has a whole group of PMCs patrolling down it. Heading down the right hand side, we see the level and world design here is pretty fantastic. The layouts of these buildings, and details like the wallpapers and objects we see put up on shelves all lends really well to the Middle Eastern setting. Lots of the windows we see in this area are completely open, giving us a good visual on the street outside to see where the enemies are positioned and where they're heading towards. And of course, the destruction is something else which blends well into the level design, looking good on its own and conveying really well how what would have once been these people's homes are now almost completely demolished combat zones, but at the same time also playing into the gameplay as well, where as you can see, similar to the vents and grass from the past games, crawling under rubble puts us into the first person perspective and gives us access to the next part of the area, in this case leading to a unique moment where a rebel soldier gets gunned down right in front of our eyes.
Please don't shoot!
A moment which, as you might have guessed, is totally missable if we don't head this way. This level of attention to detail applies to a vast majority of this opening act. Levels look fantastic, with this heavy emphasis on the absolute destruction of environments that would have once been thriving with life. And it's intricately designed in a way where there's not only multiple approaches to head forward, all of which featuring individual challenges that we have to overcome, but there's also a good exploration here, not all of it particularly being worthwhile, only getting an item or weapon that you might have perhaps already acquired, but still being there, and having me only in this last playthrough discover small areas, passageways, and shortcuts that I'd never seen before. I obviously intend to be as thorough as possible when actually capturing gameplay, and MGS4's opening section in the Middle East definitely reveals there's numerous layers which can be peeled back and appreciated in terms of all the different areas here, even if they aren't all 100% useful to the player. Regardless though, I feel like that's important. It's showcasing right from the start how MGS4 is taking a step up in terms of how it's been designed, not taking a step back or being equal to an experience from the past. For example, one thing I found pretty impressive in MGS4 is not just how broad the areas are that we can now explore in one go, having loading screens cut down immensely, but also the large number of interiors that we can also explore within these areas, that all have been created to feature slightly varied interiors and items for us to collect. We obviously did see interiors in MGS3 of course, in the form of some of the optional bases we can explore, as well as the food and armory shacks. But the expansion here makes the two incomparable. Act 1 of MGS4 feels like it's been created in a way where the more time I spend exploring it, the more I'll actually discover. My adventuring outside of making my way towards the main objective will actually get rewarded, if you get what I mean. As I've said though, the negatives however come from the acts which follow Act 1, with there being a very noticeable drop-off point in terms of this level of detail that we see here, but we'll talk about that when we get to them. Making our way into the next area, we're able to witness some funny details, like allowing us to blend in with the statues at the start. We're doing it enough times makes this happen. The level design here is also an example of the return to an emphasis on verticality, having a staircase up at the start of the area that we can use to gain a broader view of the entire area, or we can choose to proceed from the ground level instead, both of which have several guards patrolling along the way. The sound is something I paid attention to in particular, with MGS4 perhaps not totally outdoing MGS3, but at least matching the overwhelming quality of the ambience. For a large amount of the sections in this game, the musical soundtrack is once again pared back significantly, allowing us to take in the atmosphere of the world. And as we can hear from this section in particular, the ambience of the Middle East is actually quite terrifying when you pay closer attention to it, having the sounds of explosions, gunshots, and distant screams and cries echoing around us. The sound is something I found to be consistently excellent throughout the entire game. Most of the weapons really pack a punch.
If someone's watching, say hi, because I'm thinking of playing some Street Fighter.
New level to the sounds from the past. And although the original soundtrack is nowhere near as memorable as MGS 1, 2, or 3 in my opinion, it's also just nowhere near as present either. There's a distinct lack of themes, something which was almost a staple for the MGS franchise. So the absence of music is something which is heavily taking over from MGS 3 here, bar for a few of the later areas. However, there is one item we've got now that could potentially fill that void for players looking for a musical soundtrack, and that's the iPod we're given right from the start of the game. Now, that's not hyperbole, this is an actual in-game tie-in with the Apple's iPod, with other Apple products like the Mac also being found throughout the game. Say what you want about this product placement, but it's not particularly out of line with the Metal Gear series as of MGS3. Since MGS3, we've had the Calorie Maker placement, Arms magazine, and portable ops, but I do think MGS4 takes it up to a level I think many will find ridiculous. The Apple products are one thing, but even things like the books we could place down in past games to distract enemies have now literally just been renamed to Playboy here. All the cell phones we see be used are Sony Ericssons, something that in our modern world of touchscreens seems particularly out of place for a game that's supposed to be set in a future that's far more advanced than our real world. I'd argue that Peace Walker arguably has some of the lamest product placements, just on the nose, we're doing this for money type stuff. But although I do like the inclusion of things like the iPod, allowing us to play a set number of tracks that are on the iPod to begin with, as well as other ones we can find throughout our journey, the product placement does begin to feel slightly ridiculous, and I'd argue that is where Kojima's noticeable adherence to film and TV starts to reach its boiling point, something which many would argue is even more obvious from the insanely long cutscenes we see. Product placement isn't unheard of for video games, but I'd say it's far more common to see it in films and TV, and I personally feel like this is almost an attempt from Kojima to emulate that exact same kind of product placement and put it into his game. Now, on the surface, this might sound a little out of line with Kojima's style up to this point, but as I said earlier, I view MGS4 as a very key transitioning point in terms of certain creative decisions he'll go on to pursue in the future. I think the most obvious example is his recent work with directors and actors, not only in his game Death Stranding, which features the likes of Norman Reedus and Lea Seydoux playing two of the main characters, but also taking one look to his social media accounts. He always seems to be interacting with some kind of actor or director as of right now, and it's a part of Kojima that I think is now starting to drag down his creative process in terms of video games. And although it is more noticeable in the present, as I said, I think that flip gets switched in MGS4, and it only spirals on from here. If he wants to make a film, he should make a film. This ridiculous in-between, he's actively trying to make a game that's emulating a movie, is just a step too far in my opinion. The first few Metal Gears were praised for their cinematic elements, but that's not all there was to them. Whereas it's those cinematic elements that I believe begin taking away from certain parts of Kojima's most recent projects that appear, in my eyes at least, that he's starting to lose vision on what it takes to make a satisfying video game, not a satisfying movie. Some will disagree of course, but you've got to understand that I'm trying to look at this objectively as possible. Kojima is the first person that would come to mind when being asked who my favourite developer is, and he excels past pretty much everyone else by quite a long shot for me. The negatives, however, are now starting to become a lot more obvious, and I think because he's got absolute creative control now, with nobody like Konami telling him what he should and shouldn't pursue, I think someone needs to remind him that he's a video game developer, not a movie maker. I believe he could genuinely make a good movie if he tried, but the mixing of both worlds can only go up to a certain point before one begins to appear more important compared to the other, and in Kojima's case, the cinematic aspect has started to become more important for quite a while. Not just in terms of style, but as I said with Death Stranding, things like who's involved in the game's production, who the cast of the game is, if those people are thought of as good actors who've been attached to good film projects. But although I'm talking about this now, it's MGS MGS5, which is where we start to reach a boiling point. A game where Kojima puts his own childhood aspirations to be involved with Hollywood, and attempts to justify the removal of certain elements, and specifically actors the fans have grown to love, with very little of his statement adding up to anything, outside of, I like movies, I want to work with people who work in movies. So, yeah, the iPod's good. I like the J-pop song. Snake eventually makes his way into another destroyed building, taking us into a cutscene that reveals the Metal Gear Mark II, taken on the form of the exact same Mark II that we saw in Kojima's game Snatcher.
It's me, Snake. Snake, it's me.
Otacon.
As small as it may be, we've reached a point where even Snake and Otacon are using Metal Gears of some kind to help them out on their mission. We're given an operator, a tranquilizer, and something called the Solid Eye. The second Snake puts it on, making us aware this is yet another very blatant reference to Big Boss, and the eye patch we saw him wear on his right eye instead of the left like we see here. That in itself perhaps being a reference to how they may look like two sides of the same coin, but whereas one turned evil, that being Big Boss, Snake still remains heroic and noble. Thinking about it, Snake is the only one out of all of his brothers and his father who's truly heroic. Solidus comes close in my opinion, but his plan to take on the Patriots via terrorism still does make him villainous to a certain degree. He's taking people's lives into his own hands, whereas Snake remains the same man he was from MGS1, and is gonna try take down Liquid and the Patriots without resorting to anything as extreme as Solidus. Getting back into the game, we're now equipped with our Solid Eye and Operator from the get-go. The Operator being our standard USP type pistol that we become used to getting at the start of the Metal Gear games, still featuring the suppressor degradation system here, despite it being a lot less important this time round. And looking at the Solid Eye radar in the top right, we can now see how it's kind of just like a more fleshed out version of the motion detector we saw in MGS3. It's nowhere near as detailed as something like the Soliton radar, but it is still incredibly useful, allowing us to see all of the sounds that are being generated around us, as well as also showing us the infrared signatures of surrounding people as well. So it's definitely useful, but finds a good in-between from the overly generous radar from MGS2, and the far less effective motion detector from MGS3. As for the other modes, we've got night vision, which is pretty much useless due to the game very rarely being that dark, and also a scope, which is literally just the scope we've been using from MGS1, but now being integrated into the Solid Eye. It's a great little tool, although can destroy certain boss fights, as we'll eventually see, but making our way out of the building and onto the all-out war zone that's erupting on the street outside, it should become immediately apparent as to why stealth has now taken a large backseat to the MGS4 experience. What you're seeing here isn't the exception, it's the rule. There's a vast number of areas that we journey to across this game that are already brimming with combat, typically between the two enemy factions, the Rebels and PMCs. This is a factor that already offsets the stealth gameplay. Why bother sneaking around and being stealthy when there's already a full-on conflict happening right in front of our eyes? But it's actually a lot worse than that when you start breaking all the other individual elements down. The first factor we just mentioned is one that I perceive will have a subconscious effect on the player. They aren't being incentivized by anything on screen to get involved in the stealth, and you'd see a similar effect in all the games in the series if there was some kind of combat going on in all the different areas you sneak through. The enemies themselves no longer appear to have noticeable patrolling patterns. The war zone's conveyed in a more realistic manner, where the PMCs and the Rebels are oftentimes running all over the battlefield to different forms of cover, compensating for the offensive or defensive actions of each separate faction. This means that our strategy in terms of stealthing now is literally just based on eliminating enemies at best. It's hard for me to say that I was ever perceiving things like my positioning and timing when it came to my movements this time round, as a lot of the areas are so broad and jam-packed with explosions that the enemy never sees me anyway. Then adding to that, you've also got the fact that these Rebels crop up throughout almost all of the gameplay sections between Acts 1 and 2. Now, they aren't all that bad. There's actually an interesting mechanic which is in place here, which goes pretty much unsaid, and that's how you can choose to fight on the side of the Rebels to push back the PMCs during certain moments. I've heard through my research that this was apparently supposed to be a two-way system, where you could either choose